Welcome everybody to our February South Wake Conservationist public meeting. Easy for you to say. Very glad to have you here tonight, and I think we've got some pretty interesting stuff to share, and we're very pleased to have Manley Fuller as our guest speaker tonight, and you'll hear more about that in a minute. In terms of the agenda, I'll just give a very quick update on a few things that are going on, activities that are going on with the chapter, and then turn it over to John, who runs our program. He's our vice president, and he also runs the programs and education committee. So he arranges these speakers, and he'll be introducing our speaker for tonight, which is Manley Fuller, who's going to talk about conservation policy and give us an update on all the latest things that are going on there, both federally and more locally. And then finally, after the speaker is completed, we finished the questions and answers. The last few minutes of the meeting, I'd like the members to stay on because we're going to accept nominations for some of the open positions that we have coming up. So that's kind of the plan of the day. This is a fairly quick update on the chapter and what's going on. You'll see on the right-hand side a photo of some of our illustrious members, as well as Madison working hard in the bog down in Umstead State Park, planting button bushes. I think was it 18, John? 18 bushes you guys planted there?
I believe it was 19.
19, okay.
You're close.
Everybody's got their mucker boots on there and digging in the muck and getting those planted, but that's going to be great. That's one of our, I think there's 4 pollinator gardens we have now, and we're working on a 5th.
Could be working on 2 more.
Potentially 2 more. So that's Garden for Wildlife. Again, John heads up that committee. So in addition to Umstead State Park, one of the new ones that he's scoping out now, I think we have a meeting coming up very soon, is with Yates Mill County Park to do another pollinator, potentially do a pollinator garden site there. And then I guess, John, we got another one that's kind of in the early discussion stages.
Right.
Eco Kids continues to grow. I'm very excited about how that's going. There's a small team of us they're working that as a committee. We have upcoming, and I know Cassia is on tonight. Thanks, Cassia, for joining. And I just want to let everybody know that she is totally into the American black bear. She's been studying them for years, spends a lot of time in Eastern North Carolina doing both wildlife photography and conservation work, as well as some other activities that she's doing, all related to the black bear and other wildlife in Eastern North Carolina. So this is a special event for kids, part of our Eco Kids series of programs, all about the American black bear. It's going to have a lot of activities, a lot of fun, but also some good educational content as well. So that's on February 20th. We also have a lot of activity going on, planning for our big event, which is Kids in Nature Day. And some of the other chapters have been holding these for a number of years. This will be our first time doing this. We're very excited about it, and we're working with a lot of other organizations to participate in it and to bring some of their expertise and knowledge and special activities to this big event, which is going to be at the Triangle Land Conservancy's Williamson Nature Preserve, which is on the eastern end of Wake County. And you'll see there a number of organizations that we've already got commitments from. They're going to participate. And we have a number of other ones that we're still in progress working with. We've done some field trips, and we got the next one that's coming up. Actually was postponed because of ice and snow, but now we're going to hold it on February 13th. And that's a bird watch for the bald eagles out at Jordan Lake. And this is a time of year when I understand they're fairly active. We can see them in their nesting sites. And so we're hopeful that this will be a very, very interesting event and a chance to see these beautiful birds in nature. There's also a nature hike set up for Umstead State Park on March 13th. So if you want to get your hiking shoes on and join John and the others on a hike through the park and look for some natural features, join us there at Umstead Park. These are all available on our website. Just want to point out that for the deer donation program, which Guy and Judy Gardner have been leading for a number of years now, is just really had a wonderful year this past year. They did 175% of their goal in terms of the number of deer and the amount of venison that they could use to then give to food pantries after it's processed. It yielded over 20,000 meals. So hearty congratulations to them. It's a really job well done, and it does a lot of good. And it does much more than feeding the food banks. There's much more to the program, and you can see that on the website as well. In terms of events, we're going to start participating in them now that hopefully we're going to be seeing a little bit of diminishing effects of COVID, and people can start getting out and doing more as we approach spring and summer. There are some events that are starting to get scheduled, and we're going to participate as much as we can, to set up informational booths and sharing conservation information and getting people involved. So we're going to go to Cary Arbor Day on March 12th, and we're looking at Apex's. They're going to have their first Earth Fest in April 23rd, but we're still working with them on some details on that one. Last of all, I just want to say, at the end of this meeting, after we're done with our speaker, those that are members, if you could remain, I do want us to do the nomination process, which should go fairly quickly, but I want to give people an opportunity to throw their hat in the ring for a particular position. And last of all, in the upper right-hand corner, subscribe to our website. If you're not currently subscribed, please do. That's where you're going to know what's going on and when, what, where, and when. So, John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. It's my pleasure to introduce Manley Fuller. And Manley is the Vice President of Conservation Policy for the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. And he has a tremendous amount of experience in wildlife. Prior to coming to North Carolina Wildlife Federation, for many years, he was the director of the Florida Wildlife Federation. And before that, he was with the National Wildlife Federation. Manley is very well connected. It seems like he's connected to just about everybody, in conservation. He's connected to what's going on in Washington, D.C. And now, in a period of time where there's an awful lot of things going on, proposed legislation going on, regarding wildlife, regarding the plight of wildlife, Manley tonight is going to go ahead and bring us up to date on a lot of this legislation. A lot of it looks very hopeful and very promising. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Manley.
Thank you very much, John and Monty. I'm glad to present to you all tonight. I am part of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation's lobby team. We have several colleagues in Raleigh, and we work with colleagues in Washington, particularly with the National Wildlife Federation. And we also, and we'll touch on this briefly, we have worked closely with the Southern Environmental Law Center on commenting on some key federal policies, as well as with the National Wildlife Federation. Madison. This evening, we're going to primarily talk about Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which when passed, will have a profound influence on the fate of a variety of a large number of species of conservation concern in North Carolina. And we'll start with that one, and then we'll touch on chronic wasting disease, which is a problem across the nation and in Canada and some other countries. And it's a fatal disease of members of the deer family, and it's now been documented in 28 states. Wetlands protection, that's a very timely topic, and we'll go into a little more detail. And then enumerate some of the sign-on letters that we've done regarding a number of key national and federal policy issues. Then we'll take questions. So let's go on to the next slide. The Rawa, as its acronym, Recovering America's Wildlife Act, the states have identified 12,000 species nationwide in need of conservation action. In North Carolina, that includes 483 species. Next slide. The bill will ultimately, upon passage and signing by the president, would provide North Carolina $24 million a year out of a national appropriation of $1.3 billion to go to all the states and the tribes and territories in the District of Columbia, and it will promote a recovery of those, not recovery of endangered species, but it will also work at promoting keeping more common species common, and it will allow for work to be done to implement those state wildlife action plans all around the country, and particularly in North Carolina. The status of the legislation right now in the House of Representatives, the bill just passed out of the Natural Resources Committee with a vote of 29 to 15. And some of those 15 are the sponsors are working hard to reel some of them back in. But their total members of Congress as of yesterday, there were 154 members of Congress who've officially supporting the legislation. They're either sponsors or co-sponsors. In North Carolina, we're pleased that we have a number of Republicans and Democrats who've been supporting the legislation. Next slide. There's a companion bill in the Senate, which is very similar. It's not identical, but it's close, and they're trying to get them to where they're identical pieces of legislation. North Carolina was the first state to have both of its senators on board, and we currently have 32 members of the Senate who've pledged their support. We have several more that we're working on, but we're very happy that both Senators Burr and Tillis are both on board with the legislation. Next slide. So upon becoming law, this $24 million would go to the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission with a 25% match requirement for implementation of the action plan. The goal being to keep common species common, manage and restore species of greatest conservation need, create, enhance, and preserve priority habitats, and engage people through wildlife recreation. If you all have any questions later on, I'll be glad to answer them.
Oh, we've got a few more coming in actually. Chuck Rowe is asking, what is your level of optimism and timeline to pass Rawa?
Rawa is, I think, due to the bipartisan nature of it and the fact that there's strong support and supporting state wildlife activities, and I'm very optimistic that it will pass. And one of the areas that's being worked on now is to get in the Senate, the funding mechanism has been identified as environmental fines, federal environmental fines that have not been previously designated by Congress under a specific formula. For instance, the tragic Gulf oil spill of a few years back. There was a tremendous number of fines associated with that. Well, those are allocated. So you wouldn't get into those, but those others, the Senate has identified that as a funding source, and the sponsors feel like that will be sufficient to provide that 1.3 billion per year, that it'll be at that level. In the House right now, it's out of the general fund or general appropriations, and there's ongoing discussions about getting that language on funding lined up between the Senate and the House. And there may be some other ideas in the House, but that's the chief difference between the bills at this point. But anyway, not to get too much in the weeds, but we're optimistic. We do not have when the Senate, the committees are the date of a committee vote has not been scheduled, and we just had a committee vote in the House, but we think it will go to the floor in the House later this spring. So hopefully we can have the legislation passed in about midsummer to late summer.
Awesome, thanks, Manley. There's a few other questions in the Q&A, but I see, John, you have your hand up. So if you want to piggyback on any of that.
Yeah, the question I had, under number 3, it says create, enhance, and preserve North Carolina's priority habitats. So does that mean that some of this money is going to go toward actually purchasing habitat, protecting it from development?
I believe that the application of the funds, there are some details that are not final, but I believe that it will allow for key acquisitions or permanent conservation easements that clearly benefit the species, and it links back to these wildlife action plans. So if the wildlife action plan includes the need to protect a specific parcel, I believe these funds can be applied for that. But the thrust of this is basically to implement that plan. And if it's in the plan, I think it can be utilized. But it's not like the Land and Water Conservation Fund or the Great America's Outdoor Act, which passed in the previous session, which is more land-based. But I think the exact details of your question, I think is a very good question. I'll try and dig into that a little more. But I think it can, but it would need to directly tie back to those.
Let me just throw out an example. I get a lot of information from various agencies in terms of, like, for example, the sage grouse out west. And they're talking about how the habitat of the sage grouse, like a lot of species, is disappearing. So just hypothetically, I guess, in the case of something like a sage grouse, which needs a certain amount of, habitat, how would they approach that?
Well, because this is going, the sage grouse in the previous administration, there was a tremendous amount of work done on that in the Obama administration, and then that was changed in the Trump administration. But this legislation is really not federal action related to its legal status, but part of the money, and there's a lot of money is going to the states, which would be in that have that species in their range. And if the sage grouse and its needs are included in those Midwestern states where it occurs, or Eastern, Front Range, or where that animal occurs, that the work can be done to benefit the sage grouse. What I need to do is get back with you all on a detailed response on how can that be applied to a specific land unit that's critical for those species health. So let me, what I'll do is with Madison, I'll look into that and I'll send it back, and then Madison can provide that, I think, to everyone who's on the call.
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right,
Yes.
thank you. So we've just got a few more questions in the Q&A. Kristen is asking, will there be any legislation to slow over development, which I think is kind of what you were asking as well, John.
That is not part of, that would be a different kind of bill that deals with environmental regulations, and that is not within this bill.
Awesome, thank you. Bill is asking, would the time come that infrastructure money be used to support this bill's objectives?
The one area within the bipartisan infrastructure bill that can be applied that can be beneficial to species that are negatively impacted by highways is there's a provision in the the bipartisan infrastructure bill. There is $350 million, which can be allocated over a 5-year period to the states for wildlife crossings work and construction of wildlife crossings. And North Carolina has some of those, and we're actively involved in promoting additional ones. And they, that's but it would be through a competitive grant process with the federal DOT. And interestingly, yesterday, the Biden administration came out with how they intend to implement the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Then it's like a 400-page document, and it literally came out yesterday. But one of the sections in there will be how exactly will those relatively small piece of that bipartisan infrastructure bill for wildlife crossings, how will those exactly how will the states how will those competitive grants, what will be the process, how will that work? And I think in my investigation that we're talking to federal DOT is the states that have a history of doing it, and they have matching funds and those things, they're likely to get a higher priority. And North Carolina has done some areas that we're working with colleagues to identify and prioritize sites that would make the most sense from a wildlife crossing standpoint. And that could be beneficial to the conservation of species and also human safety on the highways. Anyway.
Awesome, thanks, Manley. Guy and Judy Gardner are asking, will chapter and state NCWF programs that engage with people in recreational engagement, would they qualify for any of the funding under this bill, or who exactly qualifies for the funding?
The way that the funds will be allocated to partners, it's our anticipation that we and other organizations and universities who would be cooperators in this project would be eligible for funding under this if we demonstrate to the Wildlife Commission that we're helping with implementation of the wildlife action plans. We have a memorandum of understanding with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and the Federation does. But those details have not been worked out yet, but they're under discussion and development.
Awesome, thanks, Manley. If there are no other questions, I can continue on to the next topic. All right, feel free to type them in and we can circle back to them if you do have any.
So we want to go on to chronic wasting disease?
Yep.
Okay.
All good.
So for those of you who are not familiar with this, it's a chronic wasting disease is a type of disease. It's called a prion-based disease. And in some ways it's akin to a scrapie, which occurs in sheep, and the BSE or bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or mad cow disease. They're in the same. They're related. They're not identical. They're very, and there are other diseases, and some of which have been found in humans. But CWD has not been demonstrated to be transmissible to humans. But that's a cause of ongoing concern. But what we know is that it is absolutely fatal once a member of the deer family, a mule deer, whitetail, elk, moose, and other species in the cervidae or the deer family are highly vulnerable to this disease. It's contagious. And it's a persistent in the environment, and it has spread. When I first started hearing about CWD in the 90s, I think it was in about 10 states and 2 Canadian provinces, and now it's been documented in 28 states and 4 Canadian provinces. It's in Scandinavia. And it's shown up in South Korea. But it can be spread among wild populations, and it can sometimes spread from captive populations to wild populations. The closest to here it's been documented is it has been found in locations. In one location, which got everybody's attention, was in Southern Virginia, and then in the northern part of Virginia. And it's been found in West Tennessee, adjacent areas in Mississippi, and then just very recently, it was documented in a couple of counties in Alabama. So that's, otherwise it has not been, outside of those, it's not been documented in the Southeast. It's always fatal. There's one of the difficulties for dealing with this disease is there's no live animal test in existence now to determine whether or not animals have the disease. And some of the symptoms are shown in the photograph, but you get emaciation and all these other adverse impacts of the disease. But it's primarily a disease of the nervous system, and it always kills the animal once they've gotten it. Next slide. We're working with a number of organizations, including wildlife federations, in supporting HR 5608, which would provide a total of $70 million split evenly for research and then activities to deal with the problem on the ground and to help enforce, not enforce, but to help implement control measures. And the research is to really make this, is to provide more resources to deal with this disease than have been the case. And the state wildlife agencies and the federal government, federal agencies have been working on this for quite some time, but this bill would be a real shot in the arm to that work. Next, and then that's, it's passed the House in these difficult political times. It's rare that you get a vote like this, but it was, I've got the total count. Let's see, it was 393 members of the House of Representatives voted for it and 33 voted against it. So you've always got a few. But anyway, in the Senate, it is not scheduled yet, but there's a lot of dialogue with Senate staffers, and this one should do well because it's got a lot of support and there's a lot of concern because if you look at the map of the United States where it occurs, it's getting worse, not better. Next.
Okay, so we have a few questions, or one question from Cassia. Is North Carolina looking into possible correlation of increased chronic wasting disease due to shared bait piles during the hunting season?
My understanding is that that the state has the emergency response team plan and I believe that is one of the items that they would once that is triggered, they'll look at, I think they'll look at everything, including that possibility, because something that pulls the animals together, draws them together, that increases the chances of transmission, and deer lick their faces a lot, and so things that if you have one of the things that would be done, I think if CWD is documented or in North Carolina or right on the border, then I think the Wildlife Resources Commission will look at things like, they'll look at everything.
Awesome, thanks, Manley. Are there any other questions about chronic wasting disease? No problem. If you come up with any questions, you are welcome to type them in the Q&A and we can circle back to them.
The wetlands are, at the federal level, are considered waters of the United States. There have been, it's almost been 30 years of, it's actually back to 1975. There have been legal battles over the extent of national or federal jurisdiction over waters of the United States. And wetlands are areas where the soil covers this is EPA definition. I don't need to read it to you, but that they provide tremendous benefits to the environment. They help deal with pollution, sedimentation, stormwater. They remove excess nutrients. They help deal with a variety of pollution. They replenish groundwater and drinking water, and they allow water to be held and then distributed by things like sheet flow, more gradually rather than running down, concrete ditches. And another another that great value of wetlands that's increasingly recognized as a natural or green infrastructure, which can help protect the built environment and say in cases of catastrophic storm events, et cetera. So we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, just a very brief history. I mentioned that there have been, disputes about the extent of the waters of the United States, or those areas that are subject to EPA regulation or regulation of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, there's been several decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court. They were not, there were some inconsistencies between those. And skipping over, it's an interesting history, but skipping over those and going to 2006, the Supreme Court had a split decision, and the Justice Kennedy's view prevailed in 2006. And Justice Scalia had a narrower definition of what counts as waters of the United States. The Kennedy definition includes a broad nexus from navigable waters upstream into headwaters. And then the Scalia definition is navigable waters and then a little bit more. A smart aleck lawyer, who's actually a very good lawyer, told me, he said, the Scalia rule, it means it's got enough water that you could drown in it. But forgive me for being flippant. But the majority, and then, so that's in the courts. And then there's been the Clean Water Act rule. And a subject of great interest and debate during the Obama administration was the Waters of the United States rule. And then that was developed and implemented. And then the Trump administration challenged it. And then they introduced a substitute rule. And North Carolina Wildlife Federation and a number of other organizations represented by Southern Environmental Law Center sued the Trump administration for getting rid of the Obama administration Waters of the United States rule, or clean water rule, and then they challenged the subsequent Trump administration rule, and then the Biden administration is working to rescind the Trump rule. But when it's a complicated process, federal rulemaking is a complex process and you can't do it overnight. And they are in the process right now of developing the Biden rule. And then that also, and this will be a sideline, but North Carolina's state regulation of wetlands has been for many years associated with the federal definition of wetlands. And that's been an integral part of the state's program. So when the Trump rule was the operative rule in the United States, what that did is that created a regulatory gap in North Carolina's program. And the state of North Carolina is considering right now a final wetlands rule for state wetlands protection. And we've worked closely with others on that as well. But jumping back to the federal waters and the federal rules alone, we've signed letters regarding the temporary and the permanent rules and with North Carolina DEQ. So that's which is under consideration now. And so we think that, that North Carolina will adopt the language which deals with the problem created by the Trump rule for North Carolina. That's our hope, and feel pretty good about that. And we work with a lot of partners at the state level. And then, so the Biden administration is working on a new Clean Water Act rule. So if you think that's pretty complex stuff, let's go to the next slide. Okay, I want to draw the participants in tonight's call to their attention to the Harvard Law School National Environmental Policy Summaries link. That's a good resource for you for somebody who wants to get into details about where various federal laws are and litigation about them in one place where it's kind of a succinct summary. It's a good reference. You might go to that link for future reference. But what happened is the Kennedy Scalia Supreme Court case, that was also known as Rapanos, 2006. Well, last week, as I was preparing these, working with Madison and Tara on getting this stuff together for you all tonight, the Supreme Court has taken up a case called the Sackett case, and it may have profound implications for all of this that I was just talking about. And that's a case in Idaho where a couple filled in their property and put their house on it, and EPA has been saying that they were violated the permitting requirements and everything. And this has been a protracted, since at least 2012, legal battle. And I mentioned that the Federation joined with SELC in a regional case challenging the Trump rule. Well, there were cases all over the United States, and both in support of the rule, the narrower rule of jurisdiction by the Trump administration. There were people who supported that, and then there were lots and lots of opposition to it all over the country. But the Supreme Court just tapped the Sackett case. So that's potentially not good news. So we'll wait and see, but they probably will hear that case in the next year. So that can have implications for the federal scope, jurisdictional scope of waters of the United States. And so that is, stay tuned on that. There'll probably be, there's going to be all sorts of stuff filed. The reason I say that it may not be a good outcome, as you all are aware, the people on the Supreme Court have changed in the last few years, and so Kennedy is no longer on the court, and Mr. Scalia is no longer with us. But people who agreed with Mr. Scalia have now been appointed to the Supreme Court. So we will see what happens, but it could be highly significant. And of course, we won't stop our efforts, the Federation and you all, the conservation-minded people, to try and protect these critical habitats. But we may be in for some rough weather. Next.
Okay, so before we move on to some of our last few topics, does anybody have any questions about wetlands? Feel free to type that in the Q&A. Oh, yes, I see you, John. Go ahead.
Just Manley, this week I was reading what appeared to be good news. A decision was made, I guess, by the Biden administration to protect the boundary waters in Minnesota. And I was wondering if you might want to comment on that.
Well, I'm going to have to punt on that one, John. I hate to say it because I am not I'm not familiar with the boundary waters decision. I should be. I am familiar, however, with a case, and I've talked to respected environmental lawyer about this. There was a case in Maui where the Supreme Court found that in that case, wastewater was being discharged in a volcanic area where there were a lot of lava tubes, and they were discharging from a sewer plant into, I guess, old lava tubes. And everybody was happy about, we got rid of our pollution problem. Well, that's fine until the stuff started spouting out of the side of the lava and pouring into the ocean near where there were all kinds of reefs and high quality marine habitat. And so the Supreme Court found in that case that was groundwater was subject to jurisdiction. And I thought, well, could this be more broadly applied? There's some, you can see how in Florida with places with karst topography that could be, because generally speaking, they've avoided groundwater, but that might be a useful tool, but the case may be the specifics of that particular case. But environmental lawyers are looking at that one, and it could possibly be applied to large animal feeding operations when the nitrates or whatever get into groundwater. Now, in the case of the boundary waters case, I'm not familiar with that. Is it a mine near the boundary?
Yeah, it involves a mine very close to, I think, a copper mine very close to the waters.
Well, and then there have been some other mines that like uranium mines proposed near the Grand Canyon. And then a Copper River in Alaska, which is a huge salmon spawning area, and the Biden administration has reversed the Trump administration position about mining in Alaska near the Copper River, and that was basically reinstating the decision of the Obama administration. So I'll have to look into that boundary waters case, but I'm not really familiar with it.
Thanks.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you, Manley. I don't think we have any more questions currently, so we'll go ahead and go to the next slide.
We've been working with a number of partners here in North Carolina on the issue of offshore wind, and we've provided a number of comments to the relevant federal and state agencies. There's a proposal now. There's the Kitty Hawk. It's called the Kitty Hawk Field, and Wilmington East are sites that are going to be where there will. It looks like they're going to be wind energy development off of east and south of Bald Head Island, about 24 miles east, and then further out off the Outer Banks in the Kitty Hawk Field. But that we've been providing comments, again, working closely with Southern Environmental Law Center, the National Wildlife Federation, and other partners in terms of seeing that when that's done, that they incorporate the best science and they do monitor it, and that they issues such as impacts to birds and whales, et cetera, are fully considered, and whatever is needed to be done to mitigate those or reduce those issues. So we've been working on that quite a bit. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the key functions of that, the Fish and Wildlife Service has reversed some Trump-era policies regarding the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and we've sided with Southern Environmental Law Center and others in saying that the language regarding incidental take needs to be redone, and that is, but that's one of our most historic pieces of conservation in the United States, and we think that it's very important, and we've provided comments on that. There were some definitional changes regarding the Endangered Species Act, which again we've supported a reversal of that. The Biden administration is moving in that direction, or has moved in that direction. Atlantic right whales, one of the most critically endangered species in the world, and it's subject to the level of take is extremely dangerous for the animal and the animals, and they I mean they're killed by collisions with ships. They're subject to getting entangled in gear, fishing gear, and there have been we've been working with a number of colleagues, and we'll say our South Carolina Wildlife Federation is joined, and I think Georgia and Florida Wildlife Federations have also joined. But we've been providing comments, a series of comments about rules designed to reduce the take of Atlantic right whales because they are so vulnerable. And every animal which is lost is significant because the population has gotten smaller and smaller. I think there's like 350 known Atlantic right whales, and those numbers have been showing ongoing declines. The Water Resources Development Act, that is done periodically, and it provides for funding of projects of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's part of we've encouraged in that greater the resiliency strategy to deal with storm surge, sea level rise, flooding. That we've supported actions to promote green infrastructure in that process, using using wetlands or natural features as to encourage them, as opposed to, or not always, but in lieu of gray infrastructure, just steel and concrete. And I'm oversimplifying, but using wherever we can green infrastructure as part of the response to climate change, sea level rise, storm intensity, et cetera, et cetera. We have supported the red knot critical habitat designation proposals of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and have joined comments recommending some additional areas. And coastal North Carolina has a number of red knot critical habitat areas that are on there, but it's up and down the East Coast designation proposal by the service. And then we've been doing some other work with colleagues in the Mid-Atlantic, New Jersey Audubon, which is a Wildlife Federation affiliate, and working with a number of those organizations to promote conservation protection of horseshoe crabs. And that's a key food source for the red knot. And also horseshoe crab eggs are also beneficial to important game fish, sea trout, et cetera, et cetera. So we've been involved in that. And then, as you're aware, the Wildlife Federation is involved in opposing. We exhausted our remedies. We wrote the Corps time and time again that we oppose their not using dredging windows at the port of Wilmington and Morehead City. They had dredging windows in place for 30 years, as an environmental protection measure to reduce impacts to fish and wildlife by having periods where they were not doing dredging those ports and the immediate surrounding areas. And so we exhausted our remedy in terms of letters. So we have now filed a legal challenge to the Corps' elimination of dredging windows in those two ports. We're hopeful about that. There were similar proposals in Georgia, in the port of Brunswick and Savannah, and the Corps dropped that proposal to end the dredging windows, and so they've resumed those. So it's in other words, the windows where you don't dredge during this period. Maybe it's because of there's a lot of sea turtle activity during these warmer months. Those sort of conditions that were put in place 30 years ago. That's the basis of our objection to that activity, because we think it made sense. The ports have they have a different view. So we'll see what the courts have to say about that one.
Awesome, thank you, Manley.
I'm part of a team that we have a number of really good people who work with the Federation. Kari Barsness is a lobbyist in Raleigh. David Knight, who some of you know, he's a lobbyist. And Tom Bean has a long history with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, and myself. So there you go.
Awesome, thanks. And Monty, I see you have your hand up.
Let me lower it. Okay, so Manley, thanks for going over that. I think that is really good to know, and I think you'll find everybody on this call, for sure, and many others are totally supportive of all the stuff that you're out there fighting the good fight, for conservation. I'm interested in understanding a little bit about how you accomplish the goals. Like you just listed a lot of things that, every single one of them, absolutely. I sure hope we can get that one passed or changed. How do you convince, or how do your lobbyists convince the elected officials, or maybe even the officials in departments to adopt and support the kinds of changes that we're talking about for the benefit of conservation? Because in the end, they're going to pay attention to their constituents, right? And I don't really have a good sense. I have an opinion, but I'm not sure it's right, as to what portion of the population or their constituents would favor them directing funds towards doing these things or making these kinds of changes that may affect, other people's livelihoods, if they're fishermen or whatever, right? People with farms. It's an interesting dilemma. And I'm just wondering, how do you convince these officials to make these changes when they may be getting a lot of pressure against it for economic reasons and other reasons from their livelihoods?
Well, if there's an issue, if an issue is economic, there are economic aspects in the discussion. One of the things that we often do is to provide information about the economic benefits associated with these. And I really didn't talk about that very much, other than in the green infrastructure area. But for instance, if it's I'll just use that as a simple example, but the gray infrastructure versus the green, that can also relate. You may be sheltering. You may be sheltering built infrastructure by using green infrastructure and save money and help protect the economy. If you look at almost the entire coast of the southeastern region, it's all either vulnerable or highly vulnerable to storm surge and damages. So that is that is making the case about this is where you identify where people's interests align. That's one top. You use a lot of different tactics and strategies, and you learn as much as you can about the decision makers and what they're interested in, and you try and find commonality and you work at it. But sometimes you need to make an economic case of one in recovering America's Wildlife Act. Keeping species common. Well, with some people, there's a lot of complexity that goes with a species being listed. And there's a lot of stuff that has to be done, and you've got to spend money and energy, and there's regulations associated with it. So if you can keep animals common enough so that they don't have to be listed in healthy populations, those animals won't be subject to the same type of regulatory structures that is required by a federally listed species, for instance. So if you use Rawa as an example, some of the conservative people, politically conservative, who don't really care for regulations, they may see Rawa as a relief valve. So we'll work with the states, and we'll keep these, we'll keep a whole bunch of species in the future from being federally listed. And that has an appeal to some people. I could almost, to really answer your question though, that's almost a subject of, that's a subject I'd love to get into. And that's a workshop or a topic of how do you lobby these things. Be glad to do work with you all on that in the future. And then there's other strategies. There's relation with the media, social media, outreach to the members. You do, and in simple kind of elementary kind of football terminology, you hit them high and you hit them low. You do whatever it is you need to do to get it done.
That's very helpful. I guess the underlying question I have that was kind of implied is, out of the population, this is going to be, you may know an answer, maybe you don't. What portion of the population are conservation minded or believe in the value of conservation? Or maybe it varies regionally, but do you have any sense of that?
Generally, if you look at, and I haven't seen the recent surveys, but generally speaking, surveys have been done by people like Mark Duda at a company called Responsive Management about Americans' attitudes towards wildlife. And he does survey work for all over the country. And I've known him for years. And that almost very consistently, wildlife protection, conservation, sustainable outdoor recreation, that always polls really well. Now, not everybody is, the numbers are going to drop off with who's, passionate about the regulatory apparatus or whatever. But in terms of attitudes towards conservation in general by the American population, it's pretty high. If you look at an example of that, if you look at referenda that go on the ballot around the country, in blue areas and red areas, at least 80% of those votes, oftentimes involving people taxing themselves, vote in favor of conservation lands projects. That holds up across the country. 80% or plus vote year after year after year. And the Trust for Public Lands maintains that sort of the history of those votes. And I'm familiar with that. I've worked with them in the past on campaigns to do things like that. And sometimes you'll get 70, 80% support. So it's sort of how you put it together. But there's a lot, you know, not of those people they're not all hardcore enviros. But in terms of being wanting to see habitat and wildlife, that if you put it together, a campaign, you got a good chance of winning it.
That's very encouraging. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
John, you also have your hand up.
Yeah, just had one last question for Manley. It's a general question. I sign, you know, probably every day, various petitions supporting conservation, supporting, you know, wildlife. In your opinion, how effective, when people sign these petitions politically, how effective, you know, how much effect do they have on getting something done?
Well, I think it's a necessary part of the equation. A lot of times, you're encouraging a certain attitude and how you do it, and that's part of it. But a lot of times it may be, for instance, your chapter going on an outing with a member who's supporting something that you know, to get them to support something you support, developing rapport. A lot of times there's, you know, that you can do back home kind of lobbying. That's one part of the equation. And then, you know, there's do's and don'ts when you actually go in their offices and how you deal with direct lobbying. I mean, I'm not even talking about, you know, how you legally have to do. I'm just talking about how you actually do it. And if you can establish rapport with people, you may not agree with them on a lot of other societal issues, but what you want to do is try, if you can, try and form common ground. And that is that's an important technique.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Are there any other questions? Feel free to type them in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand. If not, I will turn it back over to Monty to finish out the meeting tonight. So yeah, if you end up having a question, feel free to go ahead and put it in the Q&A, but I'll go ahead and turn it over to Monty, and we'll also provide links in the follow-up email along with the recording of this webinar. And with Manley's permission, we can also provide his email in case you have any other questions.
Oh yeah, oh sure. And I'm getting ready to type a question to my Rawa NDC expert, Naomi Edelson. I'm gonna ask her the question about the land acquisition associated with this.
Awesome. Thank you, Manley. All right, all over to you, Monty.
Works better when I'm unmuted. I just want to say thank you very much, Manley. This was very, very informative. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else did. Appreciate the time you took to meet with us tonight. And John, I don't know if you wanted to wrap up with any comments. You arranged Manley coming this evening, so.
No, Manley, it was a great presentation. This is something that I'm very passionate about, and I look forward to having you on some future presentations. So
absolutely,
thanks so
much. I love doing this stuff, and it's always enjoyed being outdoors and enjoyed studying animals, and then try and translate that into decision making regarding habitat and stuff like that. So it's great to work for the Federation, which allows me to do that, and so very much appreciate you all having me on, and glad to do anything you want to do going forward.
Sounds great.
All right. Well, thanks very much. And Manley, we're just going to do a little nomination process here within the chapter. So feel free to drop if you'd like, unless you want to watch.
Well, I'll bid you all fond adieu.
All right. Thank you.